In this example, we're being asked to convert 380 parts per million into percent. Now we're going to use the factor label method to do this, and remember what the factor label method says. It says you take the number you have, 380 parts per million, and you put it over 1 to make it a fraction. Then you multiply by the number 1, but you express the number 1 in such a way so as to make the units cancel the way you want them to. How do we express the number 1? We use the conversion relationship between parts per million and percent. That was given in the book. 1% is the same thing as 10,000 parts per million. Now, since 1% equals 10,000 parts per million, I can take those two things and put them over one another and still have 1. So I can make a fraction that is 1% over 10,000 parts per million, and that equals 1. Or I can make a fraction that is 10,000 parts per million over 1%. That also equals 1. Now the question is, which fraction do we use in the conversion? Well, let's suppose I use the second fraction, 10,000 parts per million over 1%. If I took the number I have, 380 parts per million over 1, and multiplied by 10,000 parts per million over 1%, that would give me a number, but the number wouldn't mean much because the units parts per million don't cancel. I want the units parts per million to cancel, so I'm left with percent. That means I need to use the first fraction. If I use that first fraction and multiply 380 parts per million over 1 by 1% over 10,000 parts per million, now we see the parts per million cancel, and the only unit I'm left with is percent. So now all I have to do is deal with the numbers. 380 over 1 times 1 over 10,000. Well, that's the same thing as 380 divided by 10,000. That's 0.0380. And the unit is percent, because that's the only unit left over. So the answer is 0.380%.